Welcome to Music Row Dealmakers, where we explore our world of making deals from Nashville's famed Music Row, in the heart of Music City. We are the Dealmakers, from composing to closing. Now, here's your hosts, Barry Neal Schrum and Dennis Disney.
Hello, I'm your host, Barry Neal Schrum. My co-hosts Dennis and Doug will join us in just a few minutes to discuss some of the deals that we will parse out in our introduction. So welcome to the third episode of Music Row Dealmakers, from composing to closing. In our last episode, we looked at our first iconic dealmaker, Frank DeLeo, who was the personal manager for Michael Jackson during his Thriller years and a close friend of mine before his death. But today, we're turning our attention to our second installment of Iconic Dealmakers. So for this purpose, we're going to be dialing the dial back on our time machine to the 1920s in order to explore the world of deal making in that era. That was the era of the Roaring Twenties, of course, the jazz age. It was a time shortly following Henry Ford's invention of the assembly line, and manufacturing companies all across the country began manufacturing products and using his idea to make it a better world. And consumers were snatching up new technologies left and right. This was the dawning of the radio, the record player, the piano, the player piano, all of this going on in this Roaring Twenties era. So that's the stage that is set. So let's take the specific date of January 4th, 1920, when the Champaign News-Gazette published a story about a local theater owner who had big plans for a new building project in downtown Champaign, Illinois, featuring a 12-story, 330-room hotel, incorporating a 2,200-seat theater, a barbershop, a coffee shop, and a bowling alley. That local theater impresario was none other than a man named Charles C. Pyle. He had the nickname of Cash and Carry Pyle for his first two initials. Pyle was a schemer. He was a dreamer and a deal maker. He parlayed that into a lot of successful ventures, and that's why it's worth exploring him in our iconic deal maker series. Ultimately, the hotel, theater, bowling alley combination never materialized, but what Pyle did ultimately build was the Virginia and Park Theater in Champaign, Illinois, which, by the way, is still standing and still showing movies and other things. Pyle was, as I said, an interesting fellow. His deal-making abilities and his ability to see the talent in individuals, see the potential in entertainment, see the value. This would ultimately lead Pyle down divergent paths that took him far away from the theater business and led him to several moderately successful precursors to what we now refer to as a sports agency, for example, or a professional football league, or a tennis tour. In fact, some say these are the precursors to people like WME and the NFL and the ATP. One biographer described Pyle as a combination of the talents of P.T. Barnum, Don King, Colonel Tom Parker, and Oral Roberts, all colorful people in their own rights and perhaps future iconic deal makers. But the combination of those people must have been pretty striking, and that's the accounts we have of Pyle. He was visually attractive. He was a taller man. He was always a sharp-dressed man, as ZZ Top might say. Wore a top hat, wore a three-piece suit, a gold chain hanging out attached to his watch, etc., etc. When Pyle entered the room, he commanded attention, something that helps in deal-making and negotiating. Now, in Champaign, of course, as well, is the University of Illinois, and that's where the story begins to get a little bit interesting for our purposes. The University of Illinois, of course, is the home of the Fighting Illini. And in 1923, the star running back for that team was none other than sophomore Red Grange. And if you don't know that name, I don't blame you, but Red Grange is one of the first people inducted into the National Football League's Hall of Fame. He was a legend. As a sophomore, in 7 games, he ran 723 yards. And as any football fan will tell you, that's a lot for a college player. He scored 12 touchdowns, and he led the Illini to an undefeated season, and they ultimately were champions in the Helms Athletic Foundation National Championship. But in addition to football, Grange himself was somewhat of an attractive man, a smart man. He modeled for local department stores, something that in those days college football players had to do to support themselves through college because they weren't allowed to take compensation. This is where Pyle and Grange began, their paths began to meet. One day during the fall of 1924, when Grange was a junior, Pyle, who was an avid football fan, and of course recognized Grange, saw him sitting in the seats in the theater. And so he told one of his ushers to bring him around for a chat after the movie to his office. And he did that. And Pyle said, okay, I like what you're doing. I know about you. So I'm going to give you free tickets for the rest of the season while you're in college. And just come down anytime you want, and you've got free admission. Now, in a deal-making world, we call that greasing the wheels. By giving Grange tickets, Pyle ensured that he would have constant contact with Grange during the course of his collegiate career because he had big plans for Grange. Pyle had an innate ability, it seemed, to recognize talent. And if you work in the entertainment industry, you understand that means something. If you can spot that it factor, whether it be sports, acting, singing, you can exploit that. You can harness that for commercial gains, and it's all done through this art of deal making. So Pyle understood this concept in this consumer world of the 1920s. He understood that the consumer wanted to be associated with great people. And this goes back well into our history. We all like to be associated with the strong, the beautiful, the great. And sometimes we express that need to associate by purchasing the products that they endorse. So there's a lesson to be learned even in these beginning stages of the story. In other words, Pyle recognized a deal, and in this case, a deal with Grange, and he immediately began to plot as to how that could be accomplished. So about a year later, following that initial encounter, Pyle stood in the line at graduation and saw Grange as now a national sports figure. In 1925, in fact, a Chicago Journal poll named Grange as one of the world's best athletes, somewhere behind Jack Dempsey and Jim Thorpe, but well ahead of notables like Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb. To Pyle, that talent, that ability, Grange's appearance, that was all money in the bank. He saw dollar signs. Now, since we're talking about football, it's important historically to understand what is going on in that world of professional football in this context. The sport of professional football had, in fact, been evolving since the late 1800s. And in the early 1900s, at this time, local companies like the Indian Packing Company began to form local teams. Now, you'll recognize this team as the Green Bay Packers, which was funded with a $500 donation from Curly Lambeau's employer, the Indian Packing Company. Similar things were happening in other parts of the country. Other local companies were forming their own football teams, the Pittsburgh Steelers, for example. And several of these local professional teams began to get together and form a conference called the American Professional Football Conference. And that was in the early 20s, and then a couple of years later, they changed that name to the National Football League. By this time, they had 18 teams that were fielding in that season, one of which was the Chicago Bears, close by to Champaign. All of this development is happening in a culture, collegiate culture, an educational culture, in which it was still frowned upon for an amateur to play professional sports, to accept cash for playing a sport. How gauche, they thought. This was the context in which Pyle goes to Grange and says, hey, if you will let me manage your post-college career, I will give you a percentage of the net revenue that I get with you. I will get you endorsement deals. I will get you places to play. I will set up a tour of cities. I will sell tickets. We will make a fortune, and I will make you, quite literally, the gridiron star, a celebrity. And so Grange agreed. And Grange happily went and told his recruiter, his coach at that time, his mentor, Bob Zupke, the famed Illinois football coach. And when he told him, Zupke blew up. He blew his top. He said, keep away from professionalism. Oh, my gosh. He said, football's not a game to be played for money. What are you thinking? And to that, the keen Grange pointed out the irony. He says, wait a minute. Yeah, Mr. Legendary Coach, aren't you coaching football for money? What's the difference? And so Grange did side with Pyle, and the next day after his blow up with Zupke, signed with the Chicago Bears the very next day. It took the NFL about 3 years before it began to achieve some national notoriety. And of course, ultimately in the 60s with the deal with CBS and the AFL and the NFL joining forces, it became what it is today. But in the beginning, it did so primarily on the back of Red Grange, and primarily based on the deal that was negotiated and closed by none other than C.C. Pyle and all of the other deals that he got for Red Grange, and we'll talk about those in the next segment. And now let me welcome into the studio Dennis Disney, my co-host, and Doug Smith, our associate. And we're going to talk about these deals a little bit. Hi there, Dennis, and welcome into the discussion stage of our show.
Mr. Barry, how are you?
I'm doing just great. With cash and carry Pyle, I don't know how you feel about it. You've done a little bit of research. I've done a little bit as well, and this guy just fascinates me. There are so many interesting facets to his character that can inform us on deal making.
Well, I think the first thing about him in particular, summed up in one word, and that's chutzpah.
I like that word.
And I think to some degree, every negotiator has to have a little bit of that. You have to have a little bit, maybe a lot of, depending on the deal. But the ability to say, hey, I'm going to take this a step too far. Because one of the principles that I learned way early in my career, and it sounds pretty simple, but people do this all the time. The first, let's say, deal negotiating points they throw out are too low. And if you start too low, you can't take them up. You can only take a deal point and come down. And so a lot of times people get tagged with the, if you will, the moniker, they've got a lot of chutzpah because they're asking for a big number or some sort of a big get, if you will. But if you're having to throw out those first numbers, even though you don't want to be so out of the ballpark that the other side says, well, there's no place for us to go. That's just that unreasonable. You don't want to go there. But if you don't start bigger, and then work your way down, you just can't go the other way. So you always end up leaving a bunch of money, usually on the table unnecessarily. So,
you don't want to be caught in the situation, the old adage of negotiating against yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Starting to either too high or too low. If you start too low, the other side says, oh, yeah, we'll take that offer. You realize, well, maybe I should have started a little bit higher. The thing about Charles Pyle that is so fascinating, I think I was telling you this before the show, is his tenacity in addition to his chutzpah. He's like a bulldog, right? And he was always looking for his next deal. And, we're talking about the deal with Red Grange and the Chicago Bears today. In our next episode, we're going to be looking at his dealings with Suzanne Langland, a historic tennis figure, and how he negotiated that and took her on a similar tour that he did with Red Grange. And then later, we're going to talk about the Bunyan Derby. So at the end of all of these deals that we're talking about, he's already looking for his next big gig. So the three things I think that come out of this story with Red Grange and the football tour is, first of all, Pyle's agent-client relationship with Red Grange. That is so common today, but in the 1920s, when this was going on, it wasn't as common. And then secondly, the idea of a national football league, that which we all kind of take for granted, was in its nascent stages in those days. And so Grange's player contract with the Bears was something that was unique at the time. And then finally, through all of that, Pyle sort of jumped ship with the National Football League and started forming his own league because they wouldn't give him what he wanted. So there are so many lessons I think we can learn from this guy. So let's start with the agency agreement with Red Grange. I think, that's one of the first important lessons that can be gleaned from his deals. The thing about that is that it was built on relationships, and I know one of the most important things in negotiating and deal making is your relationship with other parties.
Well, one of the best definition of business that I've ever been taught is getting things done through people. And that's really what you're talking about here. How many of us have received a complete cold call from some salesperson trying to sell us whatever? We don't know them. We can't trust them. We have no idea what we can believe and can't believe in that regard. So the relationship becomes really, really important. And when you're dealing in all of businesses that way, but especially in things like entertainment that we do so much of, there's so many people trying to get into this business and so many people trying to take advantage of people coming into this business that if you don't have relationships that you can call on and go back to, and then they introduce you to new relationships because of the trust factor they have with you, that's really how these things start coming together and building. And it's amazing when you look back, and I look back at my career, how many different business deals I've done with people that I already know. And I think that's so critical to what we're doing here. So a great agent, whether you're in entertainment or sports or the arts in any other capacity, these agents are selling, quote unquote, their clients to people they already work with and they already know. Or it's a brand looking for an endorser will come to the agent or agency, but the agent is already going to have an idea of who this brand is. Typically, they can do the research on that. So I think the point you're making is relationships fundamental to doing any business deal. It has to be that way. And then because you've got a relationship, hopefully, that means that both sides put together a fair deal for each side.
Right. And I think the word you used in all of that was trust, that you've got to develop with these relationships. And when you have that, like you say, it makes things easier, makes life easier. For Pyle, he was aware of Red Grange, and Red Grange had already kind of built up a certain reputation because of his skills, kind of like celebrities and sports figures do today. We recognize those people who are the best among us, the brightest, the smartest, and all that. So for Pyle, he at the time was a theater operator, and he saw Red Grange come into his theater to watch a movie or whatever was going on that day. And he established that connection early on. He called him into his office, back to his office, and made the deal with him that, just keep in touch and I'll give you free tickets to the shows. Just come anytime you want. So his first little, I guess, wedge into the relationship was, hey, you like movies? You like shows? I enjoy watching you play football. I'd like to get to know you better. Come on down. I'll give you all these tickets. And you and I know in this business of entertainment these days, that's commonplace. But for Pyle, it was a way to establish that relationship with Grange, who he wanted to contract with.
Yeah. I think one of the key elements to all that is, because we see it so often, Pyle here wasn't being a moocher. He knew he wanted a relationship with Grange.
Right.
He may not have fully understood where that may go yet, or he may have. He may have had a completely clear vision. He just needed to get Grange on board. But you can't just go to someone you don't know and start saying, give me your time, give me your name, give me your talent, and I'll make you a star. You have to say, look, I'm willing to put something into this. And here, Pyle was putting some stuff into this. He's putting some time. He's putting something of value that Grange was interested in, the movie tickets and stuff like that, while they developed this relationship. And I know for me, way too often over the years, I would get calls from people who wanted something. They didn't really want to give me anything. They just wanted something.
Right.
And you got to find that balance between the two. I do think that you give to get. Yes, I give space in my theater, here are my tickets, et cetera, because I want to get a relationship with you. And then if that develops over time into something bigger, then great. When I was in artist management, that was a big part of how I would sign clients, is I got to know them. I would give them advice. I would give them access to other people or something like that as I was developing the relationship. And then over time, it became hey, I need this from you now. But not in a manipulative way. That's the other piece. You got to be careful. For long-lasting deal-making relationships, it can't be manipulative. It's got to be fair and equal, but you also have to have, I think, proper respect for each other. At least that's the way I want to operate.
Well, and there's a fine balance between giving of yourself to someone you want to do business with and being taken advantage of or by a manipulator. That's why I think you mentioned the stranger on the phone, trying to sell you something. I think that's why initially people are put off by that, because they don't know, is this guy just a scam artist? Is he manipulating me, or can I trust him? And so I think you're right. And I think that's what happened here with Pyle, right? The way he welcomed him into his theater, and Grange took him up on it. And he began to do that throughout his 2 or 3 more years at college. And they saw each other, and they built a relationship, and they built trust. And during none of that time did Pyle go to him and say, hey, I want to sign you right now so nobody else gets you. Right? He waited until he was ready to graduate. So he took a very systematic approach to this, and I think that's part of his genius. And so ultimately, that unique relationship that he built with Grange, it became a form of what we know of as a sports agent, right? Even though Pyle probably would not have described himself that way, but that's effectively what it took. He took a percentage of whatever it was he was going to get for him, and he got a lot. I don't know if you went through some of these things he got, man, but he got over $500,000 in those days, that day's dollars, not our dollars, $500,000 in $1920. I don't even know what that would be. But he got a $300,000 movie contract for Pyle. He got a $13,000 advance for a sweater manufacturer. Apparently, Grange was fond of wearing sweaters. They made a doll that looked like Red Grange for $10,000 advance. They got a candy bar company for the same amount. Shoes, ginger ale, caps, and just all kinds of things. And so Grange even got a $10,000 advance from a cigarette company, even though he said, I don't smoke, but my best friends do. So why can't I capitalize on this a little bit? So I think you had a quote you wanted to share.
If Mr. Google is right, that 500,000, I said roughly from 1930.
Yeah.
It's a pushing $10 million.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
Yeah. That beats Frank DeLeo's $6 million deal we talked about in the last episode.
No, the quote that you were addressing came from a book by Jim Reisler on cash and carry. The book was called The Spectacular Rise and Hard Fall of C.C. Pyle, America's First Sports Agent. And the quote is, quote, bursting from obscurity, He, meaning Pyle, had invented a profession all by himself, becoming America's first full-scale sports agent, a man who represented an athlete in micromanaging each and every deal, from contracts to what to wear, what to say to the newspaper men, and where and when to play. That's common practice today, but in Pyle's day, it was a revolutionary concept, end quote. And that is true. Back in the day, the sports agent had not been invented back in Grange's time, obviously. There were people who brokered different things, et cetera, I'm sure, but not to the degree that it looked like cash and carry Pyle was trying to do. But now, bring that forward to the early 60s. There was a lawyer actually out of Cleveland, Ohio, named Mark McCormick, who was a golf nut, had played golf in college, but he started out through references, somehow connected to Arnold Palmer and then to Jack Nicklaus and then to Gary Player. Those were his first three clients. It's the three of the 4 or 5 people you put on golf Mount Rushmore. And but his point to all that was, we're going to do everything for you. So they managed every deal, managed appearances, managed obviously endorsements, handled their taxes, a whole variety of things, but they took 25%, for doing all that.
Right.
Which is, when you deal with agents and or managers, I have to tell clients this all the time. The more you're asking them to do for you, the more you're going to have to pay them, which is fine as long as they're earning their money. But don't think you're going to get all of that for 5%. It's not going to happen.
Exactly.
But so the sports agent today, as we jump into 2025, the sports agent today is where they are based upon the work that Pyle started, if you will, and bring all that through. And then you get the McCormicks, and then you get all these others that have followed. Since then, you and I have had some pretty good conversations about various sports agents out there. And forgive me, I forget his first name, but Mr. Dell, who had started out as a tennis agent but then parlayed that into bigger things. Mark McCormick's company, International Management Group, which eventually was purchased by CAA and is now being spun off, I understand. But McCormick, they got into not just sports with golf, and then they got into some other players. They got into tennis. They were running a modeling agency at one time and a bunch of other things. They also did television productions. They became pretty much a fully integrated agency if you were in sports or entertainment.
Well, it became ultimately, that merged with WMG, and they became the monolithic sports representation that we know today, along with celebrities.
Correct. I said CAA. You're right. It was WME that bought them, and it looks like they may be spinning them out now as another separate entity that Ari Emanuel may be taking in, who is one of WME's biggest power players and co-owners of.
Right.
But today's sports agent is really built upon what cash and carry were doing. And even today, those same principles come into play. Chutzpah. Oh, my gosh. And you look at some of the stuff that Ari Emanuel has done running WME, a lot of chutzpah there, man. So the chutzpah, big vision, relationships, and that's, I think, the most fundamental part of it all is that.
It is. And Pyle, just the vision you talked about, the vision to look beyond the current culture, because in the 1920s, of course, amateur sports was sacrosanct. You didn't take money when you were an amateur. That was an obstacle he had to overcome, him and Grange. And so that kind of brings us and transitions us to this contract with the Bears, right? So when Grange was finishing his senior year, Pyle was already envisioning what he was going to do with Grange. I think he had developed the relationship to the point where he knew he would get him to sign. And it's rumored that they split everything 50-50 after expenses.
Maybe that's where Colonel Tom learned that.
Exactly. Maybe that's where he
give me 50%.
Took after Pyle, yeah. And so he had, through his theatrical experiences, and he had researched what was going on in the developing National Football League. Because at the time, those little local football teams were popping up and they were being sponsored like the Pittsburgh Steelers by the steel plants, but like the Green Bay Packers with the packing plants, and all of these sort of company affiliated teams were playing against each other. Pyle was witnessing this. He was researching this. He was reading newspapers, filling his mind with these things. And that's an important component even today in understanding your industry. You talked about Donald Dell and Mark McCormick. Mark started, as you said, with golf. Donald, on the other hand, was the tennis guy. He had Arthur Ashe. He had all the players of those days. Well, it's only a natural segue when you start seeing, okay, well, there's Donald over there doing tennis and I'm doing golf. Those two things are pretty related. Why don't we merge our efforts? And they did. That was the first step in the evolution of what ultimately became the monolithic WME and whatever it is called these days. So because of this relationship with Grange, he was aware of the celebrity that he had, and he could envision what he could do with that. And that's what led to that, the equivalent of $10 million worth of deals that we talked about earlier.
So when you look at that, back at that time period, we had radio,
right.
and I'm sure there was some broadcasting happening, not necessarily national broadcasting or local and regional, but newspapers. I mean, wire services were still able to get news out from the various areas. And here was Red Grange, who was so dominant in college, built up this great reputation. The rest of the sports world across the U.S. had heard of him, but they'd never seen him.
Right.
And the only way you could see him was to come to a game, right? That we didn't have television that
right.
they could go watch live on.
You could not.
And so that level of, or I should say, Pyle's ability to see that there's an interest married with scarcity, married with this idea of fear of missing out. Oh my gosh, he's coming to New York or coming to Chicago. I have a chance to see him, but if I don't, then what? And will he ever come back around? All that combines to create this real sweet spot to make things really happen. Now, today, we deal with streaming, we deal with national broadcast, international broadcasts. And so it's a different animal in the sense of it's not so much about scarcity, except, if you want to go see Taylor Swift on one of her big stadium tours, but you don't want to spend the hundreds of dollars for a cheap seat ticket. Okay, then, yeah, there's some scarcity there. Kind of hard to argue scarcity when she's doing 3, 4, 5 nights at a 60,000 plus seat stadium.
Right.
But worldwide, yeah, there's still some scarcity there. And there's that fear of missing out. I have the ability to go to my local theater like they did with her tour, and I can go, spend relatively small dollars. I don't know what the price was, but it's like a movie ticket, maybe 20, maybe 30. Plus all the concessions, and that's sold out everywhere. So it's still the same idea exists, but we've adapted to the current technologies that allow us to do that. And I think that's one of the brilliance of what guys like Pyle and other agents and or managers really do bring to the table. Some people say it's handling the business. Yeah, but there's this element of vision, this element of where can we go? What is possible to do? Now I've got to convince people to come around that. That's like with any deal negotiation. Here's where I want to go. This is the type of deal I want to get for my client. Now I got to get the other side to sort of rally around that somehow. But being able to see that vision is really where the riches are found.
Yeah, and putting the pieces together. I mean, you talk about something that I would describe as passion. Pyle had a passion for football. He enjoyed football, and that's what made him interested in Grange. He had been to see him play, and to see that on the fans, and then parlay that, as you said, into, well, what if somebody in Washington D.C. or somebody far away from Illinois wants to see Red Grange play? Can I make some money on that? Can I make that a deal? Can I make an opportunity out of that? And that's exactly what he began to say. And then he saw these teams forming, and he was keenly aware, because of his celebrity, that Grange was being made these offers from all these people. And he also knew Grange was young and needed guidance. So that's when he struck the deal with them and then started looking to the Bears owners. At the time, the Bears were owned by George Halas and Ed Dutch Sterneman, and they were desperate to sign Grange. And they had already written to him several times. And Halas at one point in one interview said, as an owner, manager, coach, and player, I was determined to have Red Grange on the Bears. He was a true rarity, perfectly coordinated athlete. Pyle was aware of that keen interest, that passion that Halas had for Grange, but he also could envision something more than him just playing for a local football team. He could envision, as you said, taking him on a nationwide tour. And so Pyle agreed to meet the Bears owners 3 weeks after Grange graduated at the Morrison Hotel in Chicago after Grange's last college game of the season. That was on November 21st against Ohio State. And Pyle had indicated to the owners that they intended to sign a deal at that point. On the day of the meeting, Pyle strolled into the hotel, firmly shaking hands with each of these guys and looking them directly in the eye. And Pyle, as I've already described, is a striking man, very svelte, very well-dressed, well-kept. And he was taller than both of these guys. And he was in his tailored gray flannel suit and his spats with fashionable pearl buttons. And he cut an imposing figure. Pyle stated in no uncertain terms that if they wanted Grange, they had to deal with him. So that's kind of what got the deal kicked off.
You know, it's interesting how you describe Pyle in his look, the way he carried himself. I just finished listening to a podcast last week that it was a marketing podcast, primarily for law firms, but it brought that out. It talked about presence and that ability that when you walk into the room, you don't have to be the loudest. You don't have to be the biggest. You don't have to be any of those things. But what you have to do is walk with a certain air of confidence and a certain, as a friend of mine once said, you have to let the room feel the weight of who you are. So I'm sure Pyle, it helped the way how his height and all that. But it's really more about that. And this is what I see sometimes when I'm across the table from other negotiators. You know, hopefully they don't look at me this way, but there's been way too many times I've walked into a room and I went, oh, okay, well, you know, just the way they carried themselves, they were too not meek and mild mannered is not the right thing to say, but they played really small. And that's what you can't do when you're negotiating. You only negotiate from strength.
That's exactly
And
right.
so you have to present that I've got strength. In this case, Pyle saying, I've got Red Grange. You want to talk to Grange, you got to talk to me.
Right.
Enough said.
I'm the guy.
I'm the guy.
You know, we talk about appearance and in many ways, there's a book by Damon John, and we'll talk about Damon a little bit later on in our series, but it's called The Brand Within. And his basic premise is that celebrity is a brand, much like IBM or any other corporate logo is a brand. A celebrity has that brand. I'm thinking in terms right now of the more common folk like us, the lawyers, right? Even though we're lawyers, we still need to have that appearance to understand that we are conveying a message by our presence. I'm sure you've been in the presence of attorneys who, you know, they didn't feel the need to wear a nice business attire, right? Maybe a sweatshirt and sweatpants. But you're coming into a professional office, that's conveying a message. I remember one attorney I was actually litigating against. And don't get me wrong, he was a great litigator. But he came into the to the courtroom with glasses that had been taped with duct tape, held together with duct tape. And I'm looking at him and I'm like, okay, you're either trying to present as a geek or you're just not aware of the brand you're letting off.
And I'm sure there's some people out there that are trying to do that. They're downplaying, you know, who they are to try to get an advantage or work a deal. There was a great episode of Cosby way back in the late 80s where he went to buy a new car. Now, he was a successful doctor. His wife was a successful lawyer. They were wealthy, took their son Theo with him, but he dressed up like a shabby guy. I have no money. And, of course, his son keeps interjecting things that dispel the fact that, yeah, you dress like that today, Pops, but you're not that. You've got money. You've got these things. So I know that people will, for lack of a better word, let's say, costume themselves up to try to gain an advantage. And that is true. And on the flip side of that, there are people that might walk in with a $1,500 suit and talking all this big game and don't really have it. What's the old cowboy thing? All hat, no cattle type of thing.
Yep.
Totally recognize that. But what we're talking about is authentic presence, authentic confidence and authority to talk to the person in front of you. I have been involved with, to your point, attorneys, like you said, who walked in and they're wearing old Chuck Taylors and jeans and a sweatshirt. And I'm going, okay, they're great attorneys, don't get me wrong. But in my mind, I'm more of what, going back to Mark McCormick, he said in one of his books, he wrote the book, What They Don't Teach You at Harvard Business School and What They Still Don't Teach You at Harvard Business School and 2 or 3 others. But in the first book, he told his staff at the time, we will wear jackets and ties as men, women, you will wear dresses or other professional attire, because when a 21-year-old tennis player or golfer comes into our office, they're working with you because you're managing their money. You're not there to be their friend. You're not their frat brother. You're working for them, and you need to present that image that we've got it buttoned up, and you need to trust us with your business. And I think that's the way attorneys need to be and negotiators need to be. I'm representing a client, and I know you're the same way. I can probably count on one hand the number of times we've gone into a meeting without a jacket on. Now, we may not always wear a tie because today's business environment doesn't necessarily require that in those types of settings, especially in the entertainment and sports world. I get that. But not wearing slacks or really stylish jeans, nice shoes, and a jacket, that's just taboo to me. And again, that goes to what Pyle was doing. I'm presenting an image. My brand is I'm a serious negotiator with you. We can have fun and joke around and we're all collegial and cordial, but you need to respect that I'm coming to the table on a serious matter, that we're trying to negotiate, working with people's real money. I'm trying to get money from you at a high amount. My client is wanting to make some money from you. You're looking for my client's time and talents and all this other stuff. And I think that is something we have to take seriously. We don't take ourselves seriously, if you will, but we have to take our mission and our task seriously on those things. I'm just a real big believer in that. And I recognize that there's a generation of people out there that don't see it that way. Right. I think that ends up hurting them in the long run.
It does. I mean, image is extremely important. And I think one of the things that about Pyle is that's just who he was. He was a businessman. He was in the theater business. He understood the importance of image. You didn't see him without that tailored gray flannel suit and a top hat and just whatever he wore. I mean,
that's a great point. It was his image. He was in the theater business. He saw what was happening up on the screen or on the stage and how the audience responded. Mm-hmm. And that's what you have to, you're looking for your counterpart across the table to respond to you in a way you want them to respond. And so you've got to bring that to bear in your overall presence. Now one thing, and I didn't want to get too far away from this whole thing about how he, cash and carry, Pyle performed. But if Red Grange hadn't performed on that barnstorming tour, had he not played well, had he not awed, really, according to the book, had he not awed the audiences that were watching, yep, it would have been short-lived.
Oh, it would have been.
And so that comes back to when you're putting a deal together, you have to execute. You have to perform it. It's not just, hey, you're going to give me money and I'm going to go do a little thing for you. No, you need to perform. You need to prepare for it. You need to, as the client, you need to do what needs to be done. Because again, that performance is your brand. And you want this customer that you're just signed with to keep working with you and paying you and hopefully paying you more and more over time. But the other side as well, that company needs to perform what they're looking for. If they're doing ads, put the right ads together, work with us on how best to do those. So it's a very collegial relationship when you do these deals, and every deal informs the next deal. I think you brought that up earlier. This deal leads to the next one, which leads to the next one. So if you're looking for a long-term performance business, whether it be in sports, business, the arts, whatever, you have to perform. That's the bottom line.
Oh yeah, and that was true certainly for Grange, and all the parties involved in that understood his skills and his talents, and it ended up with Pyle and his image in a special little deal, and there was some back and forth, and so he walks into the room basically, and the Bears owner Hallis says, "Okay, I'm thinking a third, 2/3. What do you think about that?" Pyle says, "Yeah, I'll take that." And Hallis was a little surprised. "You'll take that? Great." So the Bears get 2/3 and you get a third. And Pyle says, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa. No, it's the other way around." So he threw him a little curve there. Well, ultimately, after describing the tour that he had envisioned, after describing what he'd planned with this, what he called a barnstorming tour around the United States, the Bears owner ultimately agreed to a 50-50 split. So you were talking earlier about throwing out either big numbers or small number. Both sides are going to, the one that doesn't want to pay a lot is going to throw in a smaller number. The other one's going to exaggerate and throw in the bigger number. That's exactly what happened here. And it ended up, of course, that they struck a deal. And to your point earlier, it was very successful. And the Chicago Bears just had a great time with him and made a lot of money.
That reminds me, way back in the 90s, Deion Sanders was playing baseball and football, if you remember, professionally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do.
And he had, I want to say it was a Domino's commercial that he had signed on, but it was all about getting 2 pizzas. I think it was Domino's. And so it was all this idea of a certain situation and him saying, well, why not both? And one of the things were, so Deion, a fake news conference, Deion, is it football or baseball? Well, why not both? Then it cut to Deion and Jerry Jones, who had signed him, and Jerry Jones, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys. And Jones says, "So, come on, Deion, what do you think? 15, 20 million? Why not both?" They signed him because they had signed him for $35 million.
There you go.
And so that what you were talking about just sort of reminded me of that commercial. Had they come out and said, "Hey, we're thinking 60-40," I'm not even sure that would have been enough for Pyle. If he had said, "Oh yeah, me too," I think he was probably thinking, no, 66% is a huge number. Nobody gets that for these types of things, et cetera. But he wasn't going to sell it for less than 50.
And I think that's probably what he had in mind the whole time.
I do too.
So the first game, the opening game of the season, drew 40,000 people to see Grange. That was $1.75 a ticket, or $70,000. So half of that was $35,000 they made in 1925, somewhere around probably 650,000, 700,000, something like that in today's dollars. That's a pretty good little deal for one game. That's probably about what the NFL players make today.
Yeah, I'm trying to recall the lowest, because now everything's under a collective bargaining agreement. And so there's a minimum salary standard, and there's even minimums for positions, if I understand it correctly. We haven't been involved in player contracts as yet. But I think the minimum income now for an NFL player is somewhere north of 600,000. I want to say it's somewhere around 900 plus, it might even be over $1 million. That's the value of television and all the broadcast money that's coming in, obviously. But for him to look back and get, what'd you say the number was? Close to
650.
Yeah. I mean, that's almost unfathomable for the average worker back then. It's unfathomable now when you think about it.
It is.
You look up and you go, wait a minute. I'm a bench warmer. I get a rundown on kickoffs that nobody runs back anymore. and I'm making, $600,000, $700,000, $800,000, $900,000 a year. Okay. I get beat up in practice, but okay.
It's okay. Yeah. So the next part, or evolution of this story, comes, of course, in the next year, right? And in this business, the entertainment business that you and I are in, we know everybody's always looking for the next great thing, right? The next big deal. If you're signed with a label, let's say, as an exclusive artist, and then the next year they find somebody better, right? All of a sudden, your profits start going down, right? And there's always controversy, and everybody's always trying to find the next big thing. And then that's when your client might get dropped. Well, of course, similar thing happened here in the NFL. The first year was a total success. This tour with Grange made a lot of money for both the Bears and for them. So next go around, the next season, the owners of the NFL football teams held a meeting in Detroit. Pyle wasn't invited, right? Here it is, their star player, Grange, and his representative is not invited to Detroit. So Pyle had to have a plan B, and he did, right? And his plan B was, hey, I'll just form a new team. So he crashed the party in Detroit and made this big announcement in front of all the team owners and said, hey, we're going to play at the Yankee Stadium. We're going to call ourselves the New York Yankees football team. Less than a half mile from where the New York Giants played on the Polo grounds. And so this developed a love-hate relationship between Mara and Pyle. And Mara, of course, was very influential. And he perceived Pyle as trying to horn in on his territory and horn in on his profits, all because he has this one little, football player who he didn't think necessarily controlled the market. So ultimately, the other owners sort of had to sign with Mara and play with the NFL. And Pyle ultimately got kicked out, but he formed his own football league, the American Football League. And as you and I know from history, ultimately those two merged back together in, I think it was the 60s, and became what we know of as the NFL today. And
there's still, from a conference perspective, the National Football Conference,
and the NFL,
which is the original NFL.
That's correct.
And the American Football Conference, which was the original American Football League.
Right. And so that just illustrates the importance of having a plan B in your pocket. That gives you a certain amount of BOTNA. You're familiar with that term, I'm sure.
Am.
Best alternative to a negotiated deal. If you've got 2 or 3 players bidding on your skills or your celebrity, you can drive that number way up there because of this principle.
You can, and you and I have been involved in a lot of negotiations where a recording artist in particular, even an author, has one entity interested in them. And that's really where this BOTNA comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you get 2 or 3, maybe you can get an auction bidding war type happening, but those are kind of rare these days, in my opinion.
Oh, and these days,
unless you are already somewhat established and you're leaving a label or leaving a book publisher or whatever, a publishing company, music publishing company. And so you've got that track record and people start clamoring for you. But it's rare to get a bidding war happening these days in music, and especially music. But having said that, then it makes it even more important about the whole BOTNA idea.
Mm-hmm.
The what if? What if I can't get that deal with that label? What do I do? Do I just stop? Do I go back around to the list of people that's already turned me down and has shown no interest and keep trying that? A, maybe, but B, you still have to make money. You're an artist. Fortunately, today we've got many opportunities for independents to do work.
I was going to say, I think the fragmentation of the market actually helps form a BOTNA for independent artists. Whereas back in the 90s, right, the record label was the gatekeeper of distribution and the gatekeeper of marketing, radio. These days, you can get your music out there on your own. You can tour on your own. You can build a fan base on your own. You don't need the labels anymore. So the labels have had to develop a strategy for a BOTNA as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that does help sometimes in the negotiation.
It does. Where the label is really strong still is, and they recognize this because I've been in those meetings, They recognize that they're a bank.
Right.
They're the bank to fund a lot of things that the independent artists just can't. And even if the independent artist could fund it, they can't fund it at the level to accelerate that career growth. Got it. There is still some gatekeeping, obviously, that's involved, even with the streamers, to get the editorial teams at these digital service providers, DSPs, to pay attention to you, to playlist you. They'll take a call from a Warner or a Universal or a Sony quicker than Joe Schmo from Poughkeepsie. Yes, that is true. So you're still incumbent upon you as the artist to develop your own fan base, as you just mentioned, and you have the tools to do that. And you can get to the DSPs through all the various distributors that are out there. I don't want to start naming them all, but we all know who they are, from DistroKid to Symphonic to whatever. Yes, you can do that. The trick is you have to drive audience to you. But now with social media, there's ways to even do that. So there's not the plan B idea. The bottom idea has to be, if I can't get the label to sign on, and I want them to for various strategic reasons. And by the way, I tell artists all the time, a record deal is just a means to an end. Mm-hmm. You have to identify, where do you want to end up over here? The type of music you want to do, the type of audiences you want to do, the type of shows you want to do, the number of shows you want to do a year, all those things. Identify that. In many cases, major label deal is the way to go. But also in many cases, just do what you're doing independently, because that's where you're going to find fulfillment and satisfaction and happiness anyway. But setting all that up, then knowing what are the objectives. This is what CC Pyle understood as well. What is my objective? What's Red Range's objective? Let's identify that. And then we put the right deal together to accomplish that goal, regardless of what it is. It's just that now we have, thanks to digital media, we have so many more tools our artists have so many more tools at their disposal to reach an audience and to develop a fan base more so than they ever had. The label still has power, yes, and they are the bank, yes, but there's ways you can get around some of that if you need to. But as we've said before, I think we said it at the last show, no deal is better than a bad deal. Mm-hmm. Just don't go into a bad deal.
Just don't get a bad deal.
You and I have seen that how many times, where now they're locked into a deal that's multi-years long. And if you don't read the fine print well enough, I've seen contracts, well, it's only 3 albums, but look at the timing of what you can do. It's 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but it's 3 guaranteed albums. 10 years. That's a lifetime, especially in the arts. And so you don't want a bad deal, no matter what you do. Stay independent if you have to. But having said all that, the one thing I wanted to quickly mention to what you were saying a moment ago is, as you're looking at these deals and thinking about the next deal that may come along, you have to look at the length of term. And I mentioned that just briefly now. But it's not only the length of term, but are there options involved that the other party can exercise that extends your overall deal with them? Those become critical here. And in the CC Pyle's case, a lot of his things were event related, not multi-event related, but individual event related. That's one thing. But over time, I'm sure he had to develop that sense of, okay, what am I getting myself into? Are there escalations in the amount of money, if it's a multi-year deal, that I can get, kind of like cost of living raises, that type of thing. But all those things come into play here. And I have looked at, I don't know how many contracts over my career. And I had a conversation with someone just last week about it. Hey, this looks fine, except they want 5 options, 1 year and 5 options. I don't like that idea, because you want to be there for more than 2 years, you think, because you think you need that time. They may or may not have to stick with you. At the same time, even if you did that, the increases went up almost minimally. Really? So you're telling me that today you would be okay that in 5 years from now, well, it's more than that, because it's roughly 18-month period. So 10 years from now, you're okay if you're being paid in advance from them. That's $5,000 more than what you're getting today. Really? That's what you're telling me you'd be okay with. And they didn't think about it that way. They just said, "Oh yeah, option 5. I'm going to go up another 5 grand. Not a problem. Let's go do it." And I've had to calm them down and say, "Wait a minute, no, let's go for shorter term, bigger money. How about that?"
Right.
And that's hard to get, especially if they've given intimations to the other side that they would take the cheap deal.
Mm-hmm.
That's the tough part.
Yeah, you don't want to lock yourself into a lifetime deal for sure.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, let's listeners, we'll be right back with some walkaway points. So, walkaway points. I think a lot of what you've been saying, Dennis, applies here, and we can derive a lot of good walkaway points. One I would say first, right off the bat, if you're looking at staring down the barrel of one of these 10-year deals that you're talking about, look outside the box, right? When you think about deal making, don't think in traditional terms.
Mm-hmm.
Pyle wasn't thinking in traditional terms. If he were, he wouldn't have even approached an amateur sports figure to lock him into professional sports, right? That was just not heard of in the 1920s. So he was thinking outside the box. If it's never been done before, do it anyway.
No, exactly. I think part of that is what we said earlier in this recording, and that is vision, being able to see where something could go. So thinking outside the box isn't just a short-term lateral move to get you to the number you're looking for, but it is looking at, well, where could this go? Because conventional thinking says, well, this is good for 1 or 2 years. No. I'm seeing this as a 5-year plan. So think that way, and then show that value to the other side.
Right. And, we talked also early on about relationships. And I think we've covered that pretty well. But the walkaway here is start thinking of the people next to you as relation people. I tell this to my classes at Belmont, the Curb School of Music, all the time, right? You're probably sitting next to one of the next presidents of a major label or one of the best personal managers in the industry, and you don't even know it. Right. So that's a time to build relationships. Think about it in terms of that quid pro quo we talked about, right? Pyle was offering Grange something that was of value to him. And through that, they learned to trust each other. And you can only do that through a quid pro quo, and not, as you say, through manipulation, but through actually building a relationship.
No, exactly. And selfishly and candidly, I'll bring this up. We're speaking into Shure microphones at the moment.
Exactly.
And the way we acquired these was because I have a long-time relationship with an artist relations rep at Shure. And I called him up asking for some better pricing. And he said, well, wait a minute, what are you doing? Let's talk about that. And so we were able to get a equipment sponsorship with Shure. Well, that only happens because I've known this guy for literally 20 plus years. My youngest and his oldest played in a high school band together. And so we were in the quote pit crew, the parent pit crew, for a couple of years together, sweated together. But that's what it is. It goes to the relationships that you develop, and you develop those very early on. That's why I'm such a big fan of internships. If you're in college and undergrad and can take advantage of some internships, what an amazing opportunity to network and get to know people, so that when you graduate, at least against all the people who didn't take an internship, you are miles ahead of the game just in building your network and building relationships that, to your point, now come back around as the heads of companies.
That's right. That's right. Some of the best people you're going to know them already, right?
Yes.
And so just build on that. Another thing we can learn from Pyle and the way he approached things is to know your industry. So many people don't understand the ins and outs of their business, particularly in the music business and the entertainment business. You got to understand who the players are.
You do. Years ago, it's not original to me, but I adopted the phrase, you have to understand the game. You have to know the industry. You have to know who the players are. You have to know what roles they perform and what those roles are supposed to really be, so that when they move on or get replaced, you the people that come in, you already know what they're supposed to be doing, and so now you can deal with that. You have to be a student of the game. That was the phrase I was thinking of.
Yeah.
You have to be a student of the game, and
Well, the
which
best
means-
metaphor is a chess set, right? Or chess pieces. You got to know how each piece interacts with the
Yes.
other and moves on the board, and what they do, what goal, what function do they perform?
Deal making really is like a game of chess.
It is.
It's not checkers, and I love checkers. And my dad used to beat the dickens out of me at checkers. He just did. He always saw 2, 3, 4 moves ahead. I don't know that he ever played a game of chess in his life, but it is chess. That's really what it's about. And so you have to become that student to understand those games, those rules, et cetera. You have to read trades. You have to sit with people and just talk shop. And you have to study how some deals get put together. But yeah, it really comes down to know the business, know who the players are, be a student of the game.
Yep, I agree. And then we talked about BOTNA. Obviously, that's one of your walkaway points. Have a plan B. If you don't have an alternative to the deal you're trying to negotiate, go find one, figure one out, because that gives you the confidence to go into a deal and know that, hey, if I don't get this record deal, I can go out and distribute my stuff through a distributor
Exactly.
and have a successful career without a label. And then ultimately the label will come back to you.
Yes. Keep in mind that the greatest leverage you have is to walk away.
That's right.
If they want you bad enough, then hopefully they will come to the table with more of what you need. But again, a bad deal is worse than no deal. So
That's right. And then finally, always be prepared in negotiation for a curveball, because it's going to happen when you're negotiating. And, for Pyle, that was, walking into a room, he's saying, a third and 2/3. And then he throws it back at him and said, oh, you meant 2/3 for us and 1/3 for you. Well, that's a curveball. You got to be prepared to roll with the punches sometimes. I used to watch this show. I don't know if you've ever seen it, American Pickers.
oh yeah.
And Mike Wolf is just my idol in that regard. I love watching him negotiate these little pieces of junk, because it really illustrates negotiation very well. What you have here is, to most people, trash, right? And here you have Mike Wolf saying, I'll give you $1,000 for that. And then you have people say, well, no. And then he throws back at him, well, I don't want to sell this price, because these people are looking at this piece of junk like it's, their mother gave it to them, or their grandmother or something, and like it's worth $1 million, and it's not. And, for Mike, he's got to calculate his return on investment and try to figure out if he can sell this in his store. And so he's got all these other considerations. So, always be prepared for that curveball.
That reminds me of doing yard sales and garage sales with my wife. We take all this junk and put it out there, and she said, well, I want to sell this for, I'll just pick a number, whatever it is, $50. Okay, fine. If somebody pays that, great. I think they're dumb to do it. And then I'll be standing there and somebody will come up and say, well, I'll give you $15 for that thing that she wanted 50 for. I'm like, I'll take it, because I know that it's not worth anything. But
My experience with yard sales, when I put $50 on it, people offer me 10 cents. Because it's always the people looking for the deals that go to yard sales.
I will say, my father, one time when I was a senior in high school, we were trying to buy a car, and I kid you not, Barry, this negotiation with the car dealership went on for over 2 hours, and it got down to $25 difference. And my father said no. Now, this was 1979, so $25 was a lot more than it is today, but it's not that big of a deal.
Right.
And he said, no. He said, I've told you my price. I'll go to here. Well, come on, Mr. Disney, and finally the guy said, look, we were running a promotion today for the salespeople that whoever sold the first car today would get an extra $25. Nobody sold a car today. I'll split that with you. And my dad said, okay.
Well, I think that's a perfect.
He saved $12.50, man.
$12.50. I think that's a perfect place to end our discussion of Pyle on the NFL. We'll be talking about his foray into the tennis world on the next episode. I hope you join us. I look forward to that.
Music Row Dealmakers is a production of Shrum Disney and Associates, recorded on location on Music Row, the heart of Music City, Nashville. Subscribe to future episodes wherever you enjoy your podcasts.